My hair is so thirsty right now, it's ready to set up its own Tinder profile. Hello guys, it's Reija and welcome to my October reading wrap-up. Now, I read quite a lot in October, but the amount of pages I read didn't quite amount to a lot of books read. I spent most of the month reading Malice by John Gwynne. This was part of the Faithful and the Fallen read-along that's hosted by Frankie at Frankie Reads. And I had a lot of fun with it. Or rather, I had a lot of fun with the group reading. There was a lot of activity over on Goodreads and people were discussing the different chapters and the different characters. And I found that that exchange and that kind of activity made the reading a lot more enjoyable for me than it probably would have been if I was reading the book by myself. Don't get me wrong, Malice was pretty entertaining and I think it was okay. It was an okay read, but I think for me it is slightly too traditional of a fantasy. Like, if I had read that book, say, a few years back, I probably would have loved it. But in the last couple years, I've been reading like N.K. Jemisin and Ken Liu, and I've been making an effort to kind of steer away from the tradition. And I've been making an effort to sort of steer away from the traditional fantasy with the European Viking setting and a sort of traditional hero's journey. And this book is exactly that. It is heavily inspired by European history. It is heavily inspired by Christian theology and sort of Christian lore. The story is basically about a war between gods and how these various different humans get entangled in it and people picking sides and taking part in various factions and such. And it is about corruption, and there are these vessels for these gods that these gods are using for their gains, for their own gains in the human realm. And it is very traditional. That does not make it bad, but I'm just going to point out it is very traditional. I quite liked the theological themes, the Christian themes, the whole angels and demons visual was very heavy on this book. And I kind of enjoyed that because in recent years that hasn't been so much a case in fantasy. Fantasy tends to find its roots more on the pantheistic religions such as the Viking religions and the various different religions with multiple gods. For example, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, etc. Those are usually the kinds of inspiration, and for this is definitely the struggle between God and Lucifer, for me at least. And it was pretty fun. I had trouble, though, with the fact that this book is a complete sausage fest. There is only one female point of view character in the whole thing, and the rest of the point of view characters are men. And because they are also warriors, all of them, and they all present a certain type of masculinity that is very similar to each other, I kind of started having trouble caring about them and making a distinction between them. The only The only exception was the character of Corban, who is constantly, because he's a child, he's constantly questioning what is right and what is bad and what makes a man, and how does he fit in his world's tradition of very sort of toxic masculinity. So that was interesting. But all the rest of the male characters were just a little bit too boring for me. And also, there are a lot of frigid women in this book. Like, a lot. I started keeping a spreadsheet for all the relationships, and because I started doing that, I started noticing that a lot of the characters have either dead mothers, dead wives, or unnamed mothers or unnamed wives. It's like the women don't matter in the large scale of the story, which I don't think is intentional, because the author does make a point of writing the few female characters that he has. He writes them as very interesting people. But all in all, my gripes and my sort of positive feelings about the book ended up kind of evening each other out. So I ended up giving Malice by John Gwynne 3 stars. It was an okay read, it was enjoyable, but I also had some issues with it. And the next book I read, which was the last actual book that I read during October, was Nine Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny. I had a group read with Anita from Anita Reads, and Linnea from Robot Maria Reviews, and Katie from Katie Cat Books. I will leave their information down in the description, so please check them out. And I had a really fun time with this book. It was a romp. It was super interesting. The way that it starts is kind of like the movie Memento, where you are pushed into this world with a point of view character who doesn't remember who he is, and so you're kind of finding things out with this character as he's trying to puzzle his origins and puzzle out who he is. And then after he figures things out, it becomes more of a sort of traditional high-stakes fantasy adventure. And I really like this. I went in pretty completely blind. Didn't know much about anything about this story or this series, and ended up really liking it. Zelazny uses a very straightforward writing style. He doesn't tell the reader anything that the reader doesn't need to know, pretty much. Like, the writing is very blunt, it is very straightforward, it isn't super descriptive. Like, he describes things, but only the necessary things. So there is a lot left to your own interpretation, which I really liked. And I also liked that pretty much all the characters in this book are despicable people. Like, they do have their moral qualms and their own sense of morality and their own motives and goals. But at the same time, it's almost like reading a book about a chaotic neutral or lawful evil kind of character. It was refreshing to me. Corwin is almost like an antagonist at some points. Rooting for Corwin is pretty much like rooting for the evil you know. Like, he isn't a good person, but neither are the people he's going against. So you kind of root for him because he's the least worst person in the bunch. But yeah, I had a fun time with it. It was a fun romp, and we are planning to read the rest of the Amber books every month. And in November we are going to read the second one, which is The Guns of Avalon, if I remember correctly. But yeah, highly enjoyed this, would recommend. I gave this 4 stars. And there you have it. This has been my October reading wrap-up. Join me on Friday when I'm going to be talking about all the comics that I read during October, because there were quite a lot more of those. I will see you in the next video. Bye bye!